Hello, my dear friends. You could be eating something that killed millions of Victorian women without even knowing it. Tonight we drift into a world where the promise of progress came wrapped in bright paper and sealed in shining tins, yet carried within it the seeds of slow destruction. Today's smooth puddings, colourful candies and cool glasses of soda had their own versions in Victorian Britain, versions that slowly poisoned bodies over many years while being celebrated as symbols of civilization and modernity. No one warned, no one asked the right questions, and far too many did not live long enough to tell the tale. Tonight, let's step into a world where junk food was not just sustenance but a sugar-coated death sentence, where the very foods that promised refinement delivered decay, and where the march of industrial progress left a trail of silent graves in its wake. So before you settle into the gentle rhythm of this story, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely find peace in these tales of forgotten history. And let me know in the comments where you are listening from, and what time it is for you, for it is always fascinating to see who joins us from around the world, as we explore these darker corners of the past. Now, dim the lights, perhaps turn on a fan for that soothing background hum, and let us embark on this journey together, through the shadowed kitchens and poisoned markets of Victorian Britain, where every meal was a gamble, and every bite carried the weight of hidden danger. If someone in Victorian Britain placed a bowl of white sugar upon their table, it was never merely an ingredient resting there in the gaslight, but a display of wealth and refinement that spoke volumes about the household's place in the rapidly changing world. To own sugar was to signal that one had moved beyond the realm of bare survival into that coveted space where luxury became possible, where sweetness could be scattered across baked goods with the casual confidence of those who had embraced the modern age. Families in the growing middle class sprinkled it onto their morning porridge, stirred it into their afternoon fruit juices, and even rubbed it onto cuts of meat as though the crystalline powder could elevate the flavor of anything it touched with its glittering promise. Guests arriving at social gatherings saw sugar bowls as unmistakable marks of progress, tangible proof that industry and commerce had indeed delivered the abundance that politicians and newspapers promised with such fervor. The white crystals caught the light streaming through lace curtains, creating tiny rainbows that seemed to dance with the very spirit of optimism that defined the era. Yet behind this sparkle, behind the careful arrangement of sugar spoons and delicate bowls, the substance carried dangers that were rarely spoken of in polite company, dangers that lurked in every glittering grain. The sugar that circulated through Victorian shops, stacked in barrels and measured out by the pound, was not the clean, refined product that modern palates would recognize. The refinement techniques of the time were crude at best, and the overwhelming demand far outpaced any consideration of quality or safety. To stretch supplies and save precious costs, manufacturers routinely left impurities nestled within the crystals like hidden thorns. Coal dust clung to the grains with stubborn persistence, bits of stone ground their way into the sacks during transport, and even powdered plaster was known to find its way into the mixture, added deliberately by unscrupulous dealers who understood that appearance mattered more than purity. Buyers in the bustling markets rarely questioned what they saw glittering in the merchant's scales, because whiteness alone created the powerful illusion of purity that their hearts desperately wanted to believe. A glistening surface, reflecting the weak sunlight that filtered through the smoky urban air, was all it took to assure customers that they were purchasing something safe, something worthy of their hard-earned coins. The very brightness seemed to whisper promises of cleanliness and quality, drowning out any whispers of doubt that might have stirred in more cautious minds. At mealtimes, sugar found its eager way onto every plate in the household, transforming the ordinary into something that felt almost magical. It glazed buns until they looked golden and rich, promising sweetness with every bite, turned ordinary drinks into treats that children would beg for with wide eyes and sticky fingers, and even coated roasted meats to impress dinner guests who would nod approvingly at such displays of culinary sophistication. The sweet taste masked the sourness of aging bread, concealed the telltale signs of meat past its prime, and covered the decay that might otherwise have warned careful eaters of hidden dangers lurking beneath the surface. Few suspected that in performing this masking magic, sugar also delivered hidden fragments of grit and toxins directly into their bodies with methodical precision. It is almost amusing in a bitter, twisted way to consider that people paid premium prices for what was essentially chalk and dirt, dressed up in the elaborate costume of elegance, never knowing that their pursuit of refinement was slowly destroying them from within. Sugar was not produced locally for most households scattered across the sprawling cities and cramped towns, but arrived instead in great quantities aboard ships that had traveled vast distances across treacherous oceans, These vessels carried their sweet cargo from distant colonies, where enslaved and indentured laborers had been forced to harvest the raw cane under the scorching sun, their suffering invisible to the families who would eventually consume the fruits of their brutal toil. Once the sugar reached British shores, it was processed in mills that prioritized speed and profit over safety, where the relentless rhythm of production left little room for concern about contamination or quality control. Residues from grinding machinery mixed freely with the sugar. Soot from the furnaces that powered the mills settled like black snow upon the crystals, and careless handling by workers who had neither the time nor the training to maintain proper standards added countless contaminants to what would eventually grace the tables of respectable homes. Still, despite these obvious dangers, the demand only grew with each passing season, fed by an insatiable hunger for sweetness that seemed to parallel the era's faith in industrial progress. Children begged for sweet biscuits with the persistence of those who had discovered a new form of paradise, and mothers believed wholeheartedly that serving sugared tea to their families made a home feel respectable, civilized, worthy of the modern age they all wished to embrace. To refuse sugar, to turn away from its glittering promise, would have been to admit poverty, and that admission carried a shame that few families wished to bear in an era where appearances mattered more than hidden truths. Doctors began to notice troubling effects spreading through their practices like a slow plague, though their warnings often remained frustratingly vague and difficult to pin down to specific causes. Complaints of persistent stomach pain became common in households where sugar was consumed daily, accompanied by bouts of diarrhea that left family members weak and bedridden for days at a time. Persistent fatigue settled over entire neighborhoods like a gray blanket, sapping the energy of workers and children alike, until exhaustion became the normal state of existence rather than the exception. Some medical practitioners suggested that the sweetness itself was overstimulating to the delicate nerves of their patients, while others pointed with growing concern to the visible impurities that could be detected if one examined a spoonful of sugar with sufficient care and attention. Black flecks sometimes floated in the crystals like tiny warning flags, and individual grains would crunch between the teeth with the unmistakable hardness of stone fragments that had no business being consumed by human beings. But for most families, these disturbing signs were dismissed as minor inconveniences that paled in comparison to the social benefits of serving proper refreshments. The human capacity for self-deception proved remarkably strong when faced with evidence that contradicted deeply held beliefs about progress and prosperity. In the crowded markets where daily life unfolded in all its chaotic glory, sugar was weighed out by hand, using scoops that had just finished measuring flour, grain, or even touching sacks streaked with animal waste from the transport process. Hygiene was never seriously considered in these bustling environments where speed and profit determined every transaction. Buyers watched only for that telltale white gleam that promised purity, and sellers had learned that this visual appeal was enough to maintain the trust that kept their businesses thriving day after day. The trade was brisk and profitable, coins passed quickly from palm to palm, and little thought was given to the unseen consequences that would unfold in the privacy of homes where families consumed their daily doses of contaminated sweetness. If we were to compare this situation to our present day, it would be like discovering that the neatly packaged sugar sitting on supermarket shelves today contained significant amounts of plaster dust and industrial soot, yet was still proudly advertised and sold as premium quality sweetener worthy of premium prices. The problem was not confined to those struggling with poverty, as many might assume. Even the wealthier classes, those who purchased sugar in larger quantities and stored it in fine crystal bowls, consumed the same contaminated product that had traveled through the same mills and warehouses. For them, the only difference lay in price and presentation, the illusion of quality created by silver spoons and elegant serving dishes. Sugar displayed in fine jars on polished dining tables might have looked more refined to the casual observer, but it had traveled through the same contaminated supply chain that served the poorest households. The illusion of safety that money could supposedly buy proved to be equally deceptive for all social classes. Status and wealth did not provide protection against contamination. They only succeeded in hiding the danger behind more expensive silverware and more elaborate serving rituals. The poisoning was democratic in its reach, touching every household that embraced the sweet promise of industrial progress. Critics did emerge from time to time in the press, their concerned voices occasionally cutting through the general enthusiasm for all things modern and industrial. Newspapers ran short articles warning readers about adulteration, pointing to specific cases where sand or lime had been identified in large shipments of sugar. But these warnings appeared as small items buried among larger advertisements celebrating sugar as the crowning jewel of modern industry, the sweet symbol of Britain's dominance over global trade routes and colonial production. To question sugar in any serious way was to question the very idea of progress itself, to challenge the narrative that industrial innovation was leading society toward a brighter, more abundant future. Few citizens wished to tarnish that ideal, or be seen as opponents of the modernization that promised to lift everyone toward greater prosperity and comfort. For women especially, sugar carried tremendous social weight that extended far beyond its role as a simple ingredient. Offering sweetened tea to guests was considered absolutely essential, an unmistakable sign of hospitality and refinement that marked the difference between a civilized household and one that had failed to embrace modern standards. The ritual of tea service, with its careful attention to sugar bowls and delicate spoons, became part of domestic identity, a way for women to demonstrate both their care for others and their family's social status within the community. Yet in striving to appear respectable and modern, these well-intentioned women were unwittingly poisoning themselves and their children with every gracious gesture. The contradiction cuts deep when we consider how something so ordinary, something that passed so casually from hand to mouth in parlors across the empire, masked such a quiet menace that families never fully recognized or understood. The human body reacted to this contamination over time, not always with sudden dramatic collapse that would have served as a clear warning, but with gradual weakening that could easily be attributed to other causes. Chronic constipation became a common complaint, accompanied by mysterious cramps that would appear without warning and last for hours. Nervous tremors were recorded with increasing frequency, especially among children whose smaller bodies struggled to process the foreign substances mixed into their daily sweetness. The slow damage proved particularly difficult to connect to any single source, because disease and illness already haunted the crowded cities where industrial smoke mixed with human waste to create a constant atmosphere of contamination. Few people paused to suspect the innocent sugar bowl sitting on their dining room table, because death was already so frequent in every district that assigning blame became easier when it fell on fate rather than on the food that families consumed with such trust and regularity. Meanwhile, the factories continued to pump out more of the sweet white powder, with little incentive to change their profitable methods. Regulations remained weak and poorly enforced, inspections were rare and often announced well in advance, and corruption was so common that even caught violators faced little more than nominal fines before returning to their previous practices. If one sugar dealer was caught selling adulterated products, he might pay a small penalty and continue operating under a different name, while the cycle of contamination and suffering continued without meaningful disruption. Demand drove everything in this rapidly expanding marketplace, and that demand seemed endless as more families aspired to middle-class respectability. The story of sugar in Victorian Britain captures the essence of a society that was simultaneously proud of its unprecedented progress and tragically blind to the human costs of that advancement. It reveals how appearances, social expectations, and the pursuit of wealth could completely outweigh any genuine concern for public safety or individual well-being. Sugar became not only a symbol of luxury and refinement, but also a silent accomplice to widespread illness that touched every corner of society. Wrapped in its glittering disguise of purity and progress, the bowls that graced dining tables, the sweets sold in busy markets, and the delicate spoons dipped into afternoon teacups all carried with them a hidden danger that was both invisible and ever-present, like a curse disguised as a blessing. Sugar had indeed transformed itself from the rare and precious spice of medieval times into a common companion found in every household that aspired to modern living. But its purity remained nothing more than a dangerous myth that Victorians never stopped believing, never stopped trusting, never stopped consuming. The taste of sweetness proved irresistible to a society hungry for pleasure and comfort, but with each carefully measured spoonful came grit, soot, and risk that accumulated in bodies like a slow-acting poison. A society desperate for visible symbols of modernity embraced sugar willingly and completely, never realizing how high the price of that embrace would ultimately prove to be. Sugar was cherished as undeniable proof of progress, celebrated as evidence of industrial triumph, but it carried poison hidden within its crystalline grains, quietly undermining the very families who prized it most highly and trusted it most completely. As households across the empire clung to their cherished illusion of refinement, markets kept feeding them this carefully polished deceit day after day, year after year. And waiting nearby on the same crowded stalls was another supposed innovation of industrial efficiency, a revolutionary product that promised unprecedented convenience, but concealed rot and decay inside every single tin that bore its bright, optimistic labels. Canned meat was advertised throughout Victorian Britain as nothing short of a miracle of industrial innovation, a technological breakthrough that would bring preserved protein from across vast oceans to humble tables that could rarely afford fresh cuts of quality meat. In the rapidly expanding towns and grimy industrial cities, cheap tins imported from America began appearing in shops and street markets, stacked in towering piles that seemed to promise abundance at prices the working poor could actually reach with their meager wages. For men and women who labored from dawn until dusk in suffocating factories and returned home each evening to children with empty stomachs and hollow eyes, those modest tins looked like nothing less than salvation delivered in metal packages. The canned meat was significantly cheaper than any fresh alternative. It lasted far longer without spoiling in the damp urban air, and it carried stamped right onto its metal shell the reassuring image of progress that everyone desperately wanted to believe in. Yet the promise of genuine nourishment contained within those bright labels was far more illusion than reality, because waiting inside each tin was meat that had already begun its journey toward decay long before it ever reached British shores. The process of preserving meat for lengthy ocean voyages was crude at best and often deliberately dishonest, designed to maximize profit rather than ensure safety or quality. To keep costs as low as possible and maintain competitive pricing, producers routinely used cuts of meat that were already spoiled before the preservation process even began, including scraps and offal that no sensible person would have purchased in fresh form. The salt used for preservation, when it was used at all, was not the refined seasoning that households expected, but harsh industrial crystals more commonly employed in tanneries for processing leather or in chemical works for industrial applications. To stretch the appearance of freshness and mask the obvious signs of decay, producers poured bleaching agents and other harsh chemical solutions over the meat before sealing it away in its metal tomb. These treatments successfully masked the nauseating stench just long enough for the products to survive the long voyage across the Atlantic Ocean, but when the tins were finally opened in British kitchens, the truth could no longer be hidden or disguised. It was almost laughable, in a grim and twisted way, that hard-working families believed they were providing nourishing beef for their children, when in fact they were serving salted refuse that had been disguised with industrial chemicals and sealed away in metal containers like buried secrets waiting to be unearthed. The putrid smell of the meat was often the first unmistakable sign that something was terribly wrong. Families would struggle to pry open a tin, using whatever tools they could find, only to be immediately confronted by a sour, overwhelming odor that clung to the air of their small rooms like an unwelcome ghost. But hunger possessed its own inexorable logic that could override even the most obvious warning signs, and bread remained meager, vegetables were only available seasonally, and the rare chance to add any form of protein to the family diet simply could not be ignored or wasted. Children and adults alike gathered around crude wooden tables to consume meals prepared from meat that was grey in color, mushy in texture, and heavily laced with preservative chemicals that burned the throat and upset the stomach. If the taste seemed strange or unpleasant, it became easy to convince oneself that this was simply how foreign imports were supposed to taste, that unfamiliar flavors were a natural part of embracing international trade and modern food distribution. Poverty left precious little room for suspicion or careful examination, when the alternative was watching family members go hungry night after night. The tins themselves presented another layer of danger that was largely invisible to consumers, desperate for affordable sustenance. These containers were poorly sealed using primitive techniques, often showing visible signs of rust and corrosion, and constructed from cheap metals that shed dangerous shavings and particles into the already toxic mixture contained within. Lead poisoning from the soldering used to seal the tins added another deadly element to what was already a dangerous combination of spoiled meat and industrial chemicals. Accidents during shipping and storage were frequent and widely documented, with entire cargo holds of tins spoiling completely before reaching port, their contents turning into a fetid soup of decay and contamination. Still, merchants continued to sell these ruined products without hesitation or disclosure, because no laws required the withdrawal of contaminated food from the marketplace, and no government officials bothered to inspect the contents of imported goods. Customers were warned only by the suspiciously cheap prices and the faint but persistent sourness that seemed to cling to each container, but by then their decision to purchase had already been made, and their money had already changed hands. Consuming this corrupted meat carried consequences that typically appeared within hours of a meal, creating waves of suffering that swept through entire households like a plague. Stomachs cramped with an intensity that left grown men doubled over in agony, throats burned as though acid had been poured down them, and bowels emptied violently in prolonged episodes that left victims weak and dehydrated for days afterward. Families endured long nights, filled with retching and fever, with no medicine available that was strong enough to undo the damage that had already been done to their systems. Local doctors might diagnose these episodes as simple food poisoning, but there was little they could prescribe beyond rest and clean water, luxuries that were often difficult to obtain in overcrowded urban neighborhoods, where clean water was itself a scarce commodity. In the most severe cases, weakness and dehydration gave way to complete physical collapse, and funerals followed within days as families mourned loved ones who had been perfectly healthy just a week earlier. Death was not at all unusual in the disease-ridden, overcrowded industrial districts where life was cheap and suffering was commonplace, and spoiled canned meat became simply one more silent contributor to the steady stream of mortality that characterized urban existence. Despite the obvious risks and the mounting evidence of harm, demand for canned meat persisted stubbornly in working-class neighborhoods throughout the industrial cities. The tins continued to line the stalls and shop shelves, offering their false promise of affordability and nutrition to families who had no realistic alternatives available to them. These preserved meats were cheaper than fresh fish caught in increasingly polluted waters, far more affordable than poultry that remained largely the privilege of wealthier households, and they could be stored without the ice or cellar space that most poor families simply did not possess. For laborers who were paid in pennies rather than pounds, and who faced the daily challenge of feeding large families on impossibly small budgets, the economic calculation was brutally simple. That basic affordability was enough to silence doubt and override the clear evidence of danger that manifested itself with such regularity. Housewives developed elaborate techniques for stretching a single tin into a watery stew by adding potatoes, onions, and whatever other vegetables they could obtain, managing to feed a family of 6 or more with what seemed like an impossible bargain from the industrial food system. The illusion of value mattered infinitely more than the reality of health consequences, when survival itself hung in the balance every single day. If we were to compare this situation to our modern context, it would be equivalent to discovering that budget canned food sold in today's supermarkets had been deliberately soaked in industrial bleach and stored in rusted containers for months before being sealed and shipped, yet was still marketed as nutritious family fare. The authorities who possessed the power to intervene and protect public health instead chose to look away from this systematic poisoning of the working classes. International trade brought substantial profits to the merchant classes and government revenues through customs duties, and these financial considerations mattered far more than the suffering endured by people who lacked political influence or economic power. When scandals occasionally erupted, typically triggered by clusters of deaths that were too numerous to ignore or explain away, investigations would be launched with great fanfare and promises of reform. But these inquiries invariably faded into bureaucratic silence within weeks, their findings buried in official reports that few people ever read, and fewer still acted upon. Fines levied against violators remained pathetically minimal, rarely exceeding the profits that had been generated through fraudulent practices, and the basic business model of selling contaminated food to desperate people continued uninterrupted. Reformers and public health advocates argued passionately for stricter controls and meaningful enforcement, but their voices were consistently drowned out by the much louder machinery of commerce and international trade. To the empire's leadership, feeding the poor cheaply was sufficient achievement in itself, and the quality of that food was considered a secondary concern at best. The concept that working families deserved the same food safety standards as their wealthier neighbors was simply not part of the political conversation during this era of rapid industrial expansion. Inside the humble homes where these contaminated meals were prepared and consumed, the contradiction became particularly stark and tragic. Families gathered around rough wooden tables, spooning out portions of meat that reeked of decay and chemical preservation, while genuinely believing they were participating in the modern miracle of international food distribution and industrial efficiency. It represented progress that left entire families nauseous and weakened. Progress that filled local graveyards with the bodies of children and adults who had trusted in the promise of affordable nutrition. Progress that created wealth for merchants while destroying the health of those who could afford nothing better. I cannot help but feel a deep chill when considering the countless families who were forced by economic necessity to consume what they knew in their hearts was not truly food at all, but rather industrial waste disguised as nourishment and packaged as a symbol of modern advancement. These tins represented far more than simple meals or basic sustenance. They symbolized the growing divide between those who could afford fresh cuts of properly stored meat and those who were expected to settle for contaminated scraps disguised as innovation and progress. In this way, canned meat became a cruel marker of social class, a daily reminder that the poor were expected to endure systematic poisoning, so that the wealthy could continue to enjoy purity and safety in their own meals. For the merchants and importers who controlled this trade, each shipment represented pure profit, regardless of its actual condition or safety. Every container sold generated revenue that flowed upward to company owners and shareholders, while the sickness and death remained concentrated in the neighborhoods below where political influence was minimal and complaints were easily ignored. This cycle reinforced itself endlessly and ruthlessly, with each new generation of workers repeating the same desperate choices, purchasing tins filled with spoiled meat, because no meaningful alternatives existed within their economic reach. Over time, these tragic habits became normalized to the point of invisibility, and normality served to hide the systematic cruelty that lay at the heart of the industrial food system. The history of canned meat in Victorian Britain stands as a disturbing study in false promises and manufactured progress, a product that was specifically designed and marketed to symbolize industrial achievement and international cooperation, instead delivered decay wrapped in shiny metal packaging. It was embraced enthusiastically as an emblem of technological success and global trade, while its true contents brought unnecessary suffering and premature death to countless families who trusted in the promise of modernity. The working classes paid for this version of progress, not merely with their hard-earned money, but with their health, their strength, and far too often with their lives. Canned meat carried the seductive illusion of advancement and abundance, but it rotted from the inside out, feeding families a mixture of hunger and poison that satisfied neither need while creating new forms of suffering that the industrial age seemed determined to ignore. While households across the empire pretended to share in the bounty of modern abundance, they were actually consuming little more than industrial waste that had been repackaged as food and sold with the blessing of a society that valued profit over human life. And waiting patiently in the shops nearby was another dangerous imitation, a golden spread of false butter that gleamed brightly in the gaslight, while hiding an arsenal of chemicals beneath its deceptively wholesome appearance. Artificial butter appeared in Victorian markets, like a shining solution to a problem that plagued countless households throughout the rapidly industrializing cities. Real butter remained far too expensive for most families struggling to make ends meet, a luxury that belonged to the tables of the wealthy, while remaining forever out of reach for those who earned their living through manual labor and long factory shifts. In humble homes where weekly wages barely managed to cover bread and rent, where every penny had to be carefully counted and stretched as far as possible, the yellow bricks of artificial butter stacked high in shop windows looked like nothing less than a gift from the modern industrial system. Vendors presented these products with obvious pride, boasting loudly of their affordability and year-round availability, while working-class women managing hungry households found themselves facing what seemed like an obvious and sensible choice. Real butter remained a rare luxury that appeared on their tables only during the most special occasions, while this artificial substitute was readily available in every neighborhood shop, at prices that even the poorest families could manage to afford. Yet the bright golden color that made these products so appealing concealed a much darker reality, because nestled inside each seemingly innocent slab was not genuine nourishment, but rather a disturbing mixture of animal waste and dangerous industrial chemicals. The recipe for manufacturing this false butter had absolutely nothing to do with traditional dairy farming or proper food preparation. The process began with pig fat that had been melted down from scraps and refuse, considered completely unfit for sale to any respectable customer, the kind of waste material that would normally have been discarded or used for industrial purposes, rather than human consumption. To achieve the proper consistency and hardness that consumers expected from genuine butter, manufacturers stirred in generous amounts of candle wax, the very same substance that was used to provide light in homes throughout the city after darkness fell. This wax gave the mixture its solid form and smooth texture, but also introduced a host of chemical compounds that were never intended for ingestion by human beings. Color proved to be the final and most important touch in this elaborate deception. Bright yellow powdered dyes were mixed thoroughly into the waxy base, creating that rich golden hue that consumers had learned to associate with freshness and quality in genuine dairy products. When the mixture was pressed into neat rectangular blocks and wrapped carefully in clean paper, it bore a striking resemblance to the expensive butter that graced the tables of wealthy households. But once this artificial substitute was spread on bread or melted in a hot pan for cooking, it inevitably betrayed its true origins through the greasy residue it left behind, and the acrid, unpleasant taste that lingered unpleasantly on the tongue. It is almost absurd to consider that families across the empire believed they were spreading genuine butter on their daily bread, when they were actually consuming a blend of rendered pig fat and candle wax that had been dyed to look appealing. Despite the obvious problems with taste and texture, the demand for this artificial product proved absolutely unstoppable among families who had little choice in the matter. For households that had never experienced the luxury of tasting genuine butter, this industrial imitation became their only reference point for what butter was supposed to be like. The sharp, unnatural tang that characterized the artificial product was gradually accepted as normal, and some enterprising sellers even described this harsh flavor as hearty or robust, suggesting that it represented a superior form of nutrition compared to the supposedly weaker taste of genuine dairy products. Children grew up in homes where this artificial spread was the only version of butter they had ever known, developing taste preferences based entirely on industrial chemicals and animal waste rather than on natural dairy flavors. The substitute found its way into sandwiches prepared for school lunches, was stirred into family stews to add richness and calories, and was even incorporated into homemade cakes and biscuits, where mothers hoped it would provide the fat content necessary for proper baking. The human body typically reacted quickly and harshly to consumption of this artificial butter, though families often failed to connect their symptoms to their food choices. Stomachs would cramp painfully within hours of a meal, leaving men doubled over in agony after completing long shifts in dangerous factories. Skin would break out in angry rashes that spread across faces and hands, and children would vomit violently through the night while their parents struggled to understand what was causing such widespread illness in their households. Still, by morning, these same families would return to the identical shops to purchase the identical blocks of artificial butter, because hunger possessed a remarkable ability to erase memory, and the cycle of consumption and suffering would begin again. For many families, enduring a few days of discomfort and illness seemed like an acceptable price to pay if bread could be flavored cheaply and meals could be made to feel more substantial and satisfying. The shopkeepers who sold artificial butter understood exactly what they were offering to their customers, though they rarely volunteered information about the ingredients or manufacturing process. These products were displayed attractively on clean counters, wrapped in wax paper and stacked in neat pyramids that caught the eye and suggested abundance. The blocks maintained their uniform golden color and smooth appearance under the warm glow of gas lighting, creating an illusion of freshness and quality that was entirely manufactured. The true secret behind their appeal lay in the cheap yellow dye that had been mixed into the base, a powder that was so potent it would stain fingers and tongues for hours after contact, leaving behind clear evidence of its artificial nature for anyone who cared to look closely enough. If we were to compare this situation to modern circumstances, it would be equivalent to discovering that the margarine in today's supermarkets was actually manufactured by mixing cooking oil with melted candle wax and then painting the entire mixture with industrial dye to achieve the proper color. The thought of such deception seems almost impossible to believe in our current era of food regulation and safety standards. Government authorities occasionally heard whispers and complaints about the artificial butter trade, but meaningful action rarely followed these reports. Food adulteration had become so incredibly common throughout the Victorian marketplace that imitation butter barely managed to stand out among the seemingly endless list of corrupted products that filled the shops and stalls. Reformers and public health advocates wrote passionate pamphlets warning that working families were being systematically poisoned by industrial food production, but their carefully reasoned arguments carried frustratingly little weight against the economic forces that drove the market. The poor simply could not afford genuine alternatives to these artificial products, and the wealthy had absolutely no reason to concern themselves with problems that did not affect their own dinner tables. To most government officials and civic leaders, widespread sickness among the laboring classes was simply accepted as another inevitable fact of industrial life, no more remarkable or concerning than the smoke that poured from factory chimneys or the sewage that flowed through city streets. Inside the humble homes where artificial butter was consumed daily, the contradiction between appearance and reality created particularly bitter ironies. Mothers would carefully serve slices of bread spread with golden butter to their beloved children, genuinely believing they were demonstrating care and providing proper nourishment for growing bodies. Fathers would dip their crusts into stews that had been thickened and enriched with the same artificial fat, imagining they were consuming a hearty, proper meal that would give them strength for another day of backbreaking labor. The truth remained hidden from these families. Entire households were systematically swallowing sickness that had been wrapped neatly in the false promise of modern industrial convenience. I cannot help but feel a profound chill when picturing these domestic scenes where genuine affection and parental care became tainted and corrupted through the very food that was meant to nurture and sustain family bonds. The artificial butter carried much more than dangerous chemicals into these homes. It also carried a deep sense of humiliation and social exclusion that reminded working families daily that they were permanently excluded from the world of genuine dairy products, cut off from the safety and quality that characterized the kitchens of wealthier neighbors. Each slice of bread, spread with artificial butter, represented a compromise forced by poverty, a surrender to economic necessity that had been disguised as progress and modern convenience. The product was aggressively marketed as abundance and plenty, but in harsh reality it served as undeniable proof of deprivation and systematic exploitation. The health consequences of regular artificial butter consumption multiplied dramatically over time, creating cumulative damage that affected entire families across multiple generations. Those who consumed these products on a daily basis found themselves growing progressively weaker, becoming prone to recurring fevers, and developing persistent digestive troubles that made it difficult to properly absorb nutrition from other foods. Children bore the heaviest burden of this systematic poisoning, as their smaller bodies proved completely unable to process the complex mixture of industrial toxins that they were consuming with every meal. Yet parents had no choice but to continue purchasing artificial butter, because the alternative was watching their families go hungry, and poverty made genuine butter an impossible luxury that remained forever beyond their economic reach. Merchants and manufacturers thrived financially on this systematic misery and exploitation. By transforming industrial waste into a product that could be sold at retail prices, they managed to turn refuse into substantial profit while their customers absorbed all the health risks and long-term consequences. Shopkeepers who sold artificial butter understood that appearance was sufficient to ensure a steady stream of customers, and they knew that families trapped by economic circumstances would continue to buy their products regardless of the obvious health consequences. Industry representatives boasted proudly of innovation and efficiency, while the poor were left to swallow the hidden costs in the form of rashes, cramps, and shortened lifespans. The story of artificial butter reveals the darker mechanisms of industrial food production and distribution during the Victorian era. It demonstrates clearly how appearances could be deliberately crafted to conceal filth and danger, how poverty could be systematically manipulated into acceptance of the unacceptable, and how entire communities could become unknowing participants in their own gradual destruction through the simple necessity of daily meals. The yellow glow that emanated from each block of artificial butter represented not the warmth of genuine abundance, but rather the cold calculation of systematic betrayal and exploitation. Artificial butter gleamed invitingly in shop windows throughout the empire, promising luxury and refinement to families who had never experienced either, but instead delivering sickness and disappointment to those who could afford no other choice. Its carefully manufactured golden color served to mask the poverty that forced families to consume industrial waste disguised as nourishment, while the very act of purchasing and eating it became a daily reminder of their exclusion from the world of genuine quality and safety. And waiting just beyond the displays of artificial butter, arranged temptingly on bakery counters throughout the city, were sweet cakes whose extraordinary beauty concealed something even more deadly, turning every dessert into a dangerous gamble with life itself, where each colorful bite could be the last thing a person ever tasted. Sweet cakes became the undisputed pride of Victorian tea tables throughout the empire, carefully arranged in delicate tiers and decorated with colors so vivid and dazzling, they seemed to capture the very essence of joy and celebration. In drawing rooms across towns and cities, where gaslight filtered through lace curtains and polished silver reflected the warm glow of prosperity, plates of these magnificent confections were laid out with ceremonial precision for visitors and family members alike. For the women of this era, the ability to serve or graciously consume these elaborate cakes represented far more than simple taste or momentary pleasure. These desserts had become integral components of a complex social ritual that defined respectability, demonstrated refinement, and provided clear evidence of a household's successful participation in the march of modern progress. Guests would arrive at afternoon gatherings and immediately admire the brilliant pinks, luminous greens, and radiant blues of the decorative icing, firmly believing that such extraordinary beauty could only indicate exceptional quality and careful preparation. The sweetness seemed harmless enough, even wholesome in its innocent appeal, representing a small but significant indulgence in lives that were otherwise shaped by rigid etiquette and social restraint. Yet beneath the dazzling bright frosting that caught and reflected the light so magnificently lay substances that had been drawn not from well-stocked kitchen pantries, but from the poisonous cupboards where dangerous chemicals were stored. Each colourful bite carried the genuine risk of turning a pleasant afternoon gathering into a funeral, transforming celebration into tragedy, with a swiftness that defied belief. The creation of those radiant, almost supernatural colours was achieved through methods that were neither natural nor safe, despite the innocent appearance of the finished products. Professional bakers and ambitious home cooks alike relied heavily on powders manufactured from toxic metals, choosing these dangerous substances specifically for their ability to produce vibrant shades that would never fade or dull, even under the harsh scrutiny of daylight. Lead compounds were regularly employed to create those brilliant yellows that seemed to glow with internal light, while copper-based preparations produced striking greens that appeared almost luminescent in their intensity. Mercury provided those intense reds that seemed to pulse with life and vitality, creating colors so vivid they appeared almost too perfect to be natural, which of course they were. These lethal substances were carefully ground into fine, nearly invisible dust, then stirred directly into icing mixtures or incorporated into cake batter, with the same casual confidence that a modern baker might add vanilla extract or food coloring. The final results were confections that looked almost too beautiful to consume, gleaming like precious jewels arranged on finest porcelain plates. But once these seemingly innocent treats were consumed by trusting guests, the toxic metals that created their beauty immediately began their hidden and deadly work deep inside the human body, attacking organs and systems with methodical precision. It strikes me as grimly humorous that Victorian society, which prided itself so greatly on moral elevation and cultural refinement, was simultaneously praising the elegance of pastries that had been decorated with heavy metals more appropriate for industrial laboratories than for kitchen tables. Afternoon tea had evolved into one of the defining features of polite Victorian society, and elaborate cakes stood proudly at the very centre of this important social institution. Women in particular found themselves drawn to these pastel-coloured indulgences with an almost magnetic attraction, as though the sweets themselves possessed some mystical power over feminine sensibilities. To delicately nibble on a slice of pink cake, or to take tiny measured bites of a bright green tartlet, was considered a demonstration of refinement and self-control, as though a woman's moral character could be proven through the grace and restraint with which she consumed these dangerous delicacies. The entire act of eating such elaborate cakes became part of a carefully choreographed performance, where gestures were rehearsed to perfection, words were measured with mathematical precision, and each bite was taken with deliberate slowness to demonstrate proper breeding and social awareness. Yet no amount of etiquette or refined behavior could soften the devastating impact of the toxic metals that were being systematically consumed with every delicate mouthful. The effects of this poisonous consumption appeared in many different and frightening forms throughout Victorian society. Some women began complaining of persistent headaches and unexplained fainting spells that would strike without warning, while others suffered from severe abdominal cramps that could last for hours and leave them bedridden for days. There were increasingly frequent cases where women's hands would shake uncontrollably, marking the early stages of mercury poisoning as it began its assault on the nervous system. Lead contamination dulled the skin and left complexions unnaturally pale and lifeless, creating an appearance of chronic ill health that was sometimes mistaken for fashionable delicacy. Families typically explained these disturbing symptoms as evidence of feminine weakness, nervous exhaustion, or simply the delicate constitution that was considered natural and even desirable in women of good breeding. The possibility that elegantly served cake could be responsible for such widespread suffering seemed completely unthinkable to people who had been taught to associate beauty with safety and refinement with quality. To seriously question the safety of such an established and respected social custom would have been equivalent to questioning the fundamental integrity of civilized society itself, a challenge that few people were prepared to make even in the face of mounting evidence. Some tragedies proved impossible to ignore or explain away, no matter how strong the social pressure to maintain polite silence. There are documented cases of young women, some barely 16 years old, who collapsed suddenly at their family's carefully arranged tea tables, their lips still stained with the bright pink frosting from the small cakes they had consumed just moments earlier. Within hours of these sudden collapses, previously healthy young women would be dead, their bodies overwhelmed by the concentrated metals they had unknowingly ingested during what should have been a pleasant social occasion. Families would gather to mourn these inexplicable losses, neighbors would whisper about the mysterious fragility of youth, but blame never fell upon the bakers or the confectioners who had created and sold the poisonous treats. Instead, these tragic deaths were consistently explained away as natural fate, constitutional weakness, or divine intervention. The idea that social refinement itself could poison a healthy child proved simply too unsettling for most people to accept or even seriously consider as a possibility. The baking environment of the era contributed significantly to the widespread danger, though few customers ever saw or understood the conditions under which their favorite treats were prepared. Professional bakers purchased their coloring ingredients from suppliers who saw absolutely no meaningful difference between industrial applications and culinary uses for the same basic chemicals. Powders that were specifically manufactured and sold as pigments for dyeing cloth or mixing paint could easily be relabeled and remarketed as cake colorants without any oversight or safety testing whatsoever. No laws existed to prevent this dangerous practice. No government inspections ensured proper separation of industrial and food-grade materials, and no regulatory system protected consumers from systematic deception. Bakers valued the extraordinary brilliance and permanence of these artificial hues above all other considerations, including basic human safety, often ignoring or remaining completely unaware of the serious harm their decorative choices were causing to their customers. The buying public saw only the stunning beauty of the finished products, and their enthusiastic response to colorful displays encouraged bakers to use increasingly dangerous substances in pursuit of ever more dramatic visual effects. Women proved to be the most frequent victims of this systematic poisoning, largely because elaborate cakes had become so closely associated with feminine social roles and expectations. These dangerous desserts were specifically marketed toward women and integrated into social activities that were considered primarily feminine domains, such as afternoon tea parties and ladies' charitable gatherings. Men in Victorian society were generally expected to consume heartier fare, such as meat pies, roasted joints, and ales, while women were culturally required to demonstrate their refinement through the consumption of delicate sweets at carefully orchestrated social events. This gendered division of food consumption meant that women bore a disproportionate burden of exposure to the toxic substances that made cake so visually appealing. Their participation in these elaborate social rituals became a form of proof of their proper feminine nature and social standing, yet that very participation carried a hidden cost that was measured in suffering, chronic illness, and premature death. In striving to appear elegant and socially appropriate, women were unknowingly consuming concentrated poisons that systematically eroded their health with every social gathering they attended. If we were to compare this historical situation to modern circumstances, it would be equivalent to discovering that the beautifully decorated cupcakes available in contemporary cafes were routinely made with paint scraped directly from the walls of old factories, then sold to unsuspecting customers as premium gourmet desserts. The shock and horror that such a revelation would produce in today's world serves as a powerful reminder of how completely normalized this kind of systematic deception had become in Victorian daily life. What would horrify and outrage modern consumers was then simply accepted as a routine part of cultural refinement, because appearances and social expectations mattered infinitely more than invisible truths about safety and health. The long-term effects of regular consumption of these poisonous cakes proved absolutely devastating for the women who faithfully participated in Victorian social customs. Those who attended tea parties regularly and consumed these dangerous treats on a weekly or even daily basis gradually developed chronic ailments that baffled both their families and their doctors. Lead poisoning left women chronically weak and mentally confused, unable to think clearly or maintain their energy for normal daily activities. Mercury systematically damaged their nervous systems, causing tremors, memory loss, and eventual paralysis in severe cases. Copper compounds attacked their stomachs and livers, creating digestive problems that made it increasingly difficult to obtain proper nutrition from any food source. These accumulating symptoms often blended seamlessly into the background of Victorian urban illness, where poor sanitation, industrial pollution, and overcrowded living conditions already produced constant suffering and frequent death. It became virtually impossible for families or medical professionals to separate the health problems caused by contaminated food from those caused by environmental hazards or infectious diseases. All that most people could observe was that weakness and chronic illness seemed to be the normal condition of life, and that death was never far away from any household regardless of social class or economic status. The systematic poisoning of women through their social customs remained hidden within this broader pattern of urban suffering and premature mortality. The stark contradiction at the heart of Victorian society becomes impossible to ignore when examining this particular aspect of food contamination. Here was a culture that prided itself above all else on moral virtue, social discipline, and civilized behavior, yet it was simultaneously and systematically feeding its women and children concentrated toxins disguised as symbols of elegance and refinement. Afternoon tea, which had become the very emblem of civilized social interaction and feminine grace, was transformed into a silent trap that claimed victims with every carefully choreographed gathering. Families would assemble around polished tables, friends would laugh and share gossip over delicate china, cups would clink together in toasts to friendship and prosperity, and all the while deadly poison was seeping into their bodies through every colorful bite they consumed. I find it deeply unsettling to imagine rows of well-dressed young women, smiling politely over plates filled with bright, beautiful cakes, completely unaware that their practiced gestures of social elegance were actually feeding them lethal doses of industrial metals that would destroy their health and shorten their lives. The merchants and professional bakers who profited from this systematic deception continued their practices without the slightest hesitation or moral concern. The toxic powders were readily available and remarkably inexpensive compared to natural coloring alternatives. The finished cakes sold exceptionally well to customers who judged quality primarily by visual appeal, and the health risks remained completely invisible until it was far too late to seek help or demand accountability. Even when occasional suspicions arose about possible connections between colorful desserts and mysterious illnesses, scandals typically faded quickly from public attention without producing meaningful change. Newspapers would publish brief reports warning readers about potential dangers in artificial food coloring, but no serious action followed these temporary alarm calls. Government regulations remained pitifully weak and virtually unenforced. Legal punishments for food adulteration were laughably minimal compared to the profits being generated, and economic interests consistently trumped public health concerns in political decision-making processes. The trade in toxic cakes continued to flourish generation after generation, while graves filled quietly with the bodies of women and children who had trusted in the promise of beautiful food. This tragic story of Victorian pastries represents far more than simple culinary history or isolated cases of food contamination. It serves as a powerful mirror, reflecting the fundamental values and priorities of the society that produced and consumed these dangerous treats on such a massive scale. The systematic poisoning reveals clearly how superficial beauty could be deliberately employed to mask profound danger, how social appearances could completely outweigh basic human welfare, and how entire communities could become willing conspirators in their own destruction, simply because the truth proved too ugly and uncomfortable to acknowledge openly. The brilliant colors that made these cakes so appealing to Victorian consumers were not accidental byproducts of primitive food technology, but rather deliberate choices made by adults who understood the risks and chose profit over human life. Each glittering surface represented not genuine elegance, but calculated betrayal of public trust, while every rainbow hue concealed the systematic sacrifice of women's health on the altar of social respectability. In the end, the pastel shades that decorated Victorian tea tables represented not the sweetness of civilized progress, but the bitter taste of a society willing to poison its most vulnerable members in exchange for maintaining attractive appearances and profitable commerce. These were not harmless treats that happened to cause accidental illness, but rather carefully crafted ornaments of death that were deliberately disguised as tokens of love and social grace. Sweet cakes promised elegance and refinement to women eager to demonstrate their social status, but instead delivered chronic illness and premature death to those who trusted most completely in the false promise of beautiful food. They glittered with superficial beauty and sparkled with artificial colors, but concealed industrial metals that systematically corroded the bodies and shortened the lives of countless women who had committed no crime beyond participating in the social customs of their time. From the deceptive glow of cake icing, our story now turns toward the darkness of urban kitchens, where the rendered fat of dead animals was methodically boiled into cooking oil, then sold as fresh and pure to families who trusted their daily bread to substances that should have been buried rather than consumed. Cooking oil served as the essential foundation for Victorian street food culture, providing the bubbling, smoking base for frying the fish, potatoes and small cakes that filled the air of crowded urban neighborhoods with their tantalizing scents and promises of affordable nourishment. For workers who finished their exhausting shifts in dangerous factories or on busy loading docks, the rich aroma of fried food drifting through the maze of narrow streets and cramped alleyways proved absolutely irresistible after long days of backbreaking labor. Street vendors lined these same alleyways with their portable iron pans, the oil within spitting and crackling as they dropped in pieces of battered fish or thin strips of potato, creating small islands of warmth and light in the perpetual gloom of industrial neighborhoods. Customers would crowd close around these makeshift cooking stations, eagerly trading their few precious coins for hot meals that could be eaten immediately while walking home through the smoky darkness. To families struggling with chronic poverty and persistent hunger, this readily available street food seemed like genuine comfort, offering momentary relief from the grinding hardship that characterized every aspect of urban working-class existence. Yet the oil that transformed simple ingredients into golden, crispy treats carried with it a horrifying history that few customers would have wanted to discover, because much of this cooking oil had begun its journey not in legitimate food preparation facilities, but in heaping piles of animal carcasses that had been left to decompose in city alleyways and vacant lots. Enterprising merchants seeking to maximize their profits had developed an efficient system for collecting dead animals from throughout the urban landscape, dogs that had been struck by speeding carts and left to rot in the streets, livestock that had collapsed and died in overcrowded markets, and entire carcasses that had been rejected by reputable butchers as unfit for human consumption were systematically gathered up and transported to rendering facilities on the outskirts of the city. These grisly remains were methodically boiled down in enormous vats until the fat could be skimmed from the surface and collected for commercial use, while bones were systematically smashed and stripped of every usable fragment of grease or oil that could be extracted through heat and pressure. What resulted from this revolting process was a thick, greasy substance that carried within itself the unmistakable smell of death and decay, an odor so powerful and offensive that it could not be concealed through ordinary means. To mask this telltale scent of corruption, cheap perfumes and aromatic herbs were mixed directly into the oil, creating an artificial fragrance that provided the illusion of freshness to customers who were desperate enough to believe what their noses told them. It is almost laughable, in a grim and twisted way, to consider that hungry people genuinely believed they were savoring the taste of properly fried fish, when the predominant flavor in their mouths was actually a carefully disguised blend of decomposed animal matter and chemical perfume. The contaminated oil inevitably made its way to street stalls throughout the city, where it was poured into portable iron pans and heated over open flames that drove away some of the most offensive odors, while leaving behind only the supposedly enticing scent of fried batter and cooking food. Potatoes would hiss and bubble in this tainted oil. Small cakes would turn golden brown on the surface, and fish fillets would develop the crispy coating that customers had learned to associate with proper preparation and appetizing meals. To people whose stomachs were empty and whose options were severely limited by poverty, the finished food looked and smelled absolutely delicious, representing a rare opportunity to consume something hot and filling. Coins changed hands with remarkable speed in these transactions, and few customers paused to ask uncomfortable questions about ingredients or preparation methods that might have spoiled their appetite or shattered their illusions about the food they were purchasing. The toxic effects of consuming food prepared in this recycled oil became apparent with predictable regularity throughout working-class neighborhoods. Stomachs would twist and cramp with an intensity that left grown men doubled over in agony, unable to continue working or even walk home without assistance. Digestive systems would empty themselves in prolonged waves of diarrhea and vomiting, leaving victims dehydrated and weakened for days after a single meal that had seemed harmless at the time of consumption. Fevers would develop that left workers shivering helplessly in their beds, their bodies struggling to process and eliminate the toxins they had unknowingly consumed. Children who shared fried treats with their friends often found themselves violently ill throughout the night, their small bodies completely unable to withstand the concentrated poisons that adult systems could barely tolerate. Local doctors, when they could be afforded, might diagnose these recurring episodes as simple food poisoning, but the underlying cycle of contamination and illness repeated itself with such regularity that it became part of the accepted rhythm of urban life. By morning, the same people who had spent the night retching and fevering would often return to the identical stalls where they had purchased their previous meal, because hunger possessed an inexorable power that consistently overwhelmed caution and memory. For many working families, the chance to eat something hot and substantial seemed worth enduring the inevitable suffering that would follow, especially when no other affordable options existed within their limited economic reach. The street vendors who sold these contaminated meals were themselves often trapped within the same cycle of desperation and compromise that characterized their customers' lives. Many of these small-scale entrepreneurs were impoverished women or widows who had turned to food sales as their only means of survival in an economic system that offered few opportunities for female employment. They purchased their cooking oil from wholesale suppliers who provided it in unmarked barrels at prices low enough to make street food sales economically viable, But these vendors understood perfectly well that the oil was not pure or safe for human consumption. However, they faced an impossible choice between honesty and survival, because using expensive, legitimate cooking oil would have priced their food beyond the reach of their customer base and eliminated their only source of income. The entire system trapped everyone involved, from producers to sellers to buyers, in an intricate web of deception and economic necessity, where survival required participation in practices that everyone knew were harmful and potentially deadly. The deceptive appearance of properly fried food played a crucial role in maintaining customer trust and ensuring continued sales despite the obvious health risks. A golden, crispy coating suggested cleanliness and proper preparation, even when the underlying cooking medium was composed primarily of decomposed animal matter and industrial chemicals. Batter that bubbled energetically and developed an appealing brown color in hot oil looked inviting and professionally prepared, regardless of the horrifying substances in which it had been cooked. Families purchasing these street foods genuinely believed they were participating in the modern miracle of urban food distribution, never realizing that they were actually consuming meals that had been prepared using materials that were intended for disposal rather than digestion. If we were to compare this historical situation to contemporary circumstances, it would be equivalent to discovering that popular fast food restaurants were routinely cooking their meals in oil that had been rendered from animal carcasses collected from city streets and garbage dumps, then perfumed with artificial scents to mask the smell of decay. Government authorities of the Victorian era consistently chose to ignore this systematic poisoning of the urban poor, largely because street food served important economic and social functions that outweighed concerns about public health or food safety. These readily available meals kept working-class families fed at prices they could afford, preventing the social unrest that might have resulted from widespread hunger and starvation. The health risks associated with contaminated cooking oil were considered far less urgent than the epidemic diseases that were already ravaging overcrowded urban neighborhoods, such as cholera, typhus, and tuberculosis, that killed thousands of people every year. To government officials focused on maintaining social order and economic productivity, a few cases of food poisoning or unexplained deaths seemed like acceptable casualties compared to the broader challenges of managing rapidly growing industrial cities. Reformers and public health advocates did raise serious concerns about street food safety in pamphlets and newspaper articles, documenting clear connections between contaminated cooking oil and patterns of illness in working-class neighborhoods. But their warnings carried little weight against the immediate economic pressures that drove both vendors and customers to participate in this dangerous system, and meaningful enforcement of food safety standards remained virtually non-existent throughout most of the Victorian period. Inside the cramped homes where families consumed these street foods, the fundamental contradictions of industrial-urban life became starkly apparent night after night. Parents would return from long days of dangerous factory work carrying paper packets filled with fried potatoes or chunks of battered fish, smiling with relief at the prospect of providing their children with something warm and filling for dinner. Children would gather eagerly around these modest meals, laughing and chattering, while they shared the crispy treats that represented one of their few sources of pleasure and satisfaction in lives, otherwise dominated by poverty and hardship. The simple act of eating together as a family carried with it a profound sense of comfort and normalcy, yet within hours the same rooms would be filled with the sounds of illness as digestive systems rebelled against the toxins they had unknowingly absorbed. Parents would spend sleepless nights tending to children who were racked with cramps and fever, trying to provide comfort and care while having no understanding of what had caused such sudden and severe illness in their previously healthy families. Meals that were intended to demonstrate parental love and provide basic nourishment instead became sources of suffering that deepened the already overwhelming burdens of urban poverty. I cannot help but feel profoundly disturbed when envisioning children biting eagerly into crispy golden pieces of fried food, their faces lighting up with joy and anticipation, while every mouthful delivered concentrated poisons directly into their small, vulnerable bodies that had no defense against such systematic contamination. The merchants who controlled the production and distribution of recycled cooking oil realized enormous profits by transforming what should have been disposed of as waste into a commercially viable commodity that generated steady income streams. They cared very little about the ultimate consumers of their products, understanding that there would always be sufficient demand from people who had no choice but to purchase the cheapest food available, regardless of its safety or quality. The economic calculation was brutally simple. The poor needed affordable food, and affordable food required the use of the cheapest possible ingredients and preparation methods, regardless of health consequences. This fundamental equation guaranteed a steady supply of customers who would continue purchasing contaminated street food even when they understood its risks, because the alternative was starvation. This systematic exploitation also revealed the vast economic and social inequalities that characterized Victorian urban society in all its cruel complexity. Wealthy families consumed fresh meats that were roasted in their own clean kitchens using pure butter or high-quality lard that had been properly rendered and stored under sanitary conditions. Meanwhile, the poor were forced to consume scraps and refuse that had been fried in oil, rendered from rotting carcasses, their only crime being their inability to afford safer alternatives. What was celebrated as industrial progress and urban efficiency was actually a sophisticated system of exploitation that forced those at the bottom of society to consume materials that wealthier people would not have considered fit for disposal, let alone human consumption. Over time, this cycle of contamination and illness became so deeply embedded in the routine of urban working-class life that families no longer questioned why their children developed stomach cramps after meals, or why they themselves felt weak and nauseous following their evening food purchases. Chronic illness simply became the expected background of daily existence, and the connections between specific foods and particular health problems became impossible to trace or prove. Street stalls continued to operate profitably year after year. Vendors continued to sell their dangerous products to eager customers, and coins continued to pass from hand to hand in transactions that perpetuated a system of poisoning disguised as commerce. The sizzling sounds and appetizing aromas of street food became permanent features of the urban landscape, while the suffering they caused remained hidden within the privacy of working-class homes where pain was endured in silence. The history of recycled cooking oil in Victorian Britain demonstrates with chilling clarity how the basic human need for survival could force entire populations into choices that carried devastating health consequences. It reveals how superficial appearances could effectively disguise the most revolting practices, how economic desperation could silence moral objections and common sense, and how poverty could transform poison into a form of daily sustenance that people consumed willingly because they had no alternatives. The oil that gave street food its golden appearance and crispy texture was not merely an ingredient in these meals, but rather a powerful symbol of the systematic degradation that industrial society imposed upon its most vulnerable members. It served as a constant reminder that in the pursuit of survival within an economic system that valued profit over human life, nothing was considered too foul or dangerous to be packaged, sold, and consumed by those who lacked the power to demand better treatment. Recycled cooking oil created the illusion that poor families were enjoying meals that looked and tasted similar to those consumed by wealthier neighbors, but the reality was that they were being fed concentrated doses of death and decay that had been disguised as nourishment and sold as progress. The golden surfaces of their fried foods concealed a truth far darker than the night-shrouded alleys, where hungry people gathered to purchase their daily bread from vendors who knew exactly what they were selling, but continued nonetheless. And nearby, on those same crowded stalls, sparkling in glass jars that caught and reflected the flickering gaslight, another supposedly harmless pleasure awaited unsuspecting customers. Mint candies that promised cooling refreshment, but carried industrial acids and bathroom cleaning powders, strong enough to burn throats and poison the digestive systems of children who trusted in the simple joy of sweetness. Mint candies occupied a position of particular prominence in Victorian urban markets, displayed temptingly in glass jars and wicker baskets that lined countless stalls throughout the crowded commercial districts where working families conducted their daily shopping. Children would cluster around these displays with eager anticipation and wide, hopeful eyes, while parents often found themselves reaching for a few precious coins so their little ones could experience what appeared to be a perfectly harmless pleasure in lives that offered so few opportunities for joy or indulgence. These small white lozenges were wrapped simply in bits of paper or sometimes poured directly into the outstretched palms of excited children, and they possessed an appealing appearance that suggested cleanliness, purity, and careful preparation. For families whose budgets rarely allowed for luxury items or special treats, mint candies represented an affordable way to provide their children with a moment of sweetness that could brighten even the darkest days of urban poverty and industrial hardship. The illusion created by these innocent-looking sweets proved remarkably powerful and convincing, because hidden behind their refreshing mint flavor and pristine white appearance lay not sugar and natural oils, but rather a disturbing mixture of industrial chemicals that were more commonly found in cleaning supplies and workshop storage rooms than in any legitimate food preparation facility. The manufacturing process for these deceptive candies revealed a level of callous disregard for human safety that defies comprehension, even by the standards of an era notorious for its food adulteration practices. Instead of using expensive sugar as the base ingredient, manufacturers relied heavily on borax, a harsh chemical compound that was primarily employed in laundry operations and as a cleaning agent for toilets and other sanitary fixtures throughout the city. This industrial substance provided the solid foundation necessary for creating candy that would hold its shape and maintain its appearance, but it had absolutely no legitimate place in human food production and carried with it serious health risks that were well understood by anyone with basic chemical knowledge. To create the characteristic cooling sensation that customers expected from mint candy, manufacturers added concentrated acids to their borax base, sometimes using sulfuric acid or other industrial mixtures that were designed for use in manufacturing processes rather than human consumption. These powerful chemicals provided the sharp, stinging sensation on the tongue that buyers interpreted as evidence of strength and authenticity in their mint candies, never realizing they were actually experiencing chemical burns that would cause lasting damage to their mouths and digestive systems. A few drops of synthetic mint oil were incorporated into each batch to disguise the bitter, unpleasant taste of the underlying chemicals and create the illusion of natural flavoring, transforming what was essentially a mixture of bathroom cleaner and industrial acid into something that resembled an edible confection. It is darkly comic to imagine parents throughout the empire carefully selecting mint candies for their beloved children, believing they were providing a wholesome treat, when they were actually handing out tablets composed primarily of toilet cleaning powder and acid that had been flavored with artificial oils and shaped into appealing forms. The toxic effects of consuming these dangerous pseudo-candies manifested themselves with terrifying speed and intensity, particularly in the small bodies of children who lacked the physical resources to process such concentrated chemical contamination. Within an hour of eating these substances, children would begin experiencing severe stomach cramps that left them doubled over in agony, unable to play or even stand upright without assistance. Violent vomiting would follow, sometimes continuing throughout the night as their systems desperately attempted to expel the foreign chemicals that were causing such intense internal distress. In many tragic cases, the resulting illness was dismissed by parents and neighbors as a passing weakness or attributed to the damp, unhealthy air that characterized overcrowded slum neighborhoods where proper sanitation was virtually non-existent. Few adults could imagine that the innocent white lozenges purchased from respectable market stalls only hours earlier might be the actual cause of such sudden and severe illness. Because candy was universally regarded as harmless and appropriate for children, the very concept that something designed to bring joy to young people could actually function as a weapon seemed too disturbing and incomprehensible to consider seriously. Street sellers employed aggressive marketing tactics to attract potential buyers to their dangerous wares, shouting loudly about the purity and refreshing qualities of their mint candies, while using hands that had just finished handling coal, raw fish, or other contaminated materials to scoop the lozenges from wooden trays and containers. Basic hygiene principles were completely ignored in these commercial transactions, with the same surfaces that were used for cutting meat or gutting fish, also serving as preparation areas for pressing mint candies into their final shapes. Yet the visual appeal of clean, white candy proved sufficient to convince customers that they were purchasing safe, properly prepared confections that had been manufactured under sanitary conditions. The bright, reflective surfaces of the candies caught and scattered the available light in ways that suggested purity and careful attention to quality, while the reality of their chemical composition remained completely hidden from view until the moment of consumption, when it was far too late to avoid the consequences. For children throughout the urban landscape, these mint candies represented an irresistible temptation that they would carry in their pockets, share generously with friends on street corners, and suck on slowly during their walks to school, or while playing in the narrow alleyways that served as their primary recreational spaces. Parents purchased these treats as inexpensive rewards for good behavior or small accomplishments, genuinely believing they were offering tokens of affection and providing moments of happiness in lives that were otherwise dominated by poverty, hardship, and limited opportunities for pleasure or comfort. Mothers in particular convinced themselves that giving sweets to their children represented an important act of parental care, tangible proof that even within the constraints of severe financial limitations, they could still provide small luxuries that would brighten their children's days and create positive memories. They had no understanding that they were actually distributing poison that had been wrapped in paper and disguised as an expression of love. The street vendors who manufactured and sold these toxic candies understood perfectly well the nature of demand for affordable treats among working-class families, and they recognized that parents desperately wanted to provide their children with some form of sweetness and pleasure, regardless of the cost to family budgets. By reducing their production costs through the substitution of industrial chemicals for legitimate food ingredients, these entrepreneurs could offer mint candies at prices that no legitimate confectioner could possibly match, while maintaining substantial profit margins that ensured the continuation of their dangerous trade. The economic incentives were overwhelmingly in favor of deception and contamination, because honest candy making would have priced their products beyond the reach of their primary customer base and eliminated their ability to compete in the marketplace for affordable children's treats. If we were to compare this historical situation to modern circumstances, it would be equivalent to contemporary corner stores selling brightly colored candies to excited children, with those same treats actually manufactured from powdered bleach and industrial acid that had been collected from factory floors and shaped into appealing forms designed to attract young customers. The horror that such a revelation would produce in today's world helps us understand just how completely normalized and accepted this type of systematic child poisoning had become within the social and economic structures of Victorian urban life. Medical professionals of the era did occasionally raise serious alarms about the obvious connections between mint candy consumption and sudden illness in children, writing detailed reports that appeared in newspapers and describing specific cases where previously healthy young people had collapsed immediately after eating these popular treats. The symptoms they documented included severe stomach pain, uncontrollable vomiting, and dangerous weakness that sometimes proved fatal, but their warnings lacked the institutional support and legal enforcement mechanisms that would have been necessary to actually protect children from these toxic products. Without systematic regulation or consistent testing procedures, medical suspicion could never be transformed into legal conviction or meaningful commercial accountability. Vendors simply disappeared from one neighborhood when complaints became too numerous or vocal, only to reappear in different districts under new names and continue their dangerous trade without interruption or consequence. Each temporary scandal would eventually fade from public attention and memory, replaced by the daily rhythm of market life and the constant pressure of economic survival that made both buyers and sellers willing to participate in transactions they knew carried serious risks. Inside the humble homes where these candies were consumed, the contradictions of industrial urban life reached levels that bordered on the surreal and tragic. Candy jars would sit prominently on kitchen shelves alongside bread and tea, serving as visible symbols of parental care and family prosperity even within households that struggled to afford basic necessities. Children would reach eagerly for these white lozenges, their faces lighting up with anticipation and gratitude, completely unaware that they were voluntarily consuming concentrated doses of chemicals that would cause them hours of agony and potentially lasting harm to their developing bodies. Parents would smile with satisfaction as they watched their children suck contentedly on the mint candies, never suspecting that each innocent gesture of affection was actually delivering industrial toxins directly into the mouths of the people they loved most in the world. I cannot help but feel profoundly uneasy when attempting to imagine a mother offering mint candy to her child, with genuine tenderness and care, believing herself to be providing a gesture of love and sweetness, when she was actually handing that child a tablet composed primarily of borax and acid, that would soon cause suffering beyond anything she could have imagined possible. The broader society that produced and tolerated this systematic poisoning of children had somehow convinced itself that industrial progress necessarily carried with it certain acceptable risks that had to be endured by those who wished to participate in the modern economy and urban lifestyle. The abundance of manufactured goods, including food products, was celebrated as proof of technological advancement and social improvement, while the hidden costs of that abundance were absorbed silently by families who lacked the political power or economic influence necessary to demand safer alternatives or meaningful protection from commercial exploitation. Candy was supposed to represent innocence, childhood joy, and the simple pleasures that made life worth living despite its hardships and limitations. Yet, in Victorian Britain, even these most basic symbols of happiness had been corrupted and transformed into vehicles for delivering systematic harm to the most vulnerable members of society. Over time, these dangerous mint candies claimed countless young victims throughout the empire, with some children surviving the immediate effects of chemical poisoning, while others succumbed to complications that proved fatal within days of consumption. The cycle of production, distribution, and consumption continued relentlessly year after year, with each new generation of children falling victim to the same deceptive practices that had harmed their older siblings and neighbors. No meaningful reform arrived quickly enough to protect the young people who trusted in the promise of sweetness and refreshment, because the economic and political systems that governed Victorian society consistently prioritized commercial profits over human welfare, especially when the victims were poor children whose suffering generated little public sympathy or political pressure for change. In the end, these seemingly innocent white lozenges stand as among the most chilling examples of how Victorian markets systematically transformed childhood pleasures into sources of pain and death. Mint candies promised cooling refreshment and moments of joy, but instead delivered concentrated agony and chemical burns that turned the simple act of eating candy into a terrifying gamble with lasting health consequences. Their clean, white surfaces concealed industrial chemicals that belonged in workshops and cleaning closets, rather than in the mouths of trusting children, while their refreshing mint scent masked the bitter truth that profit-driven manufacturers were willing to poison the next generation in exchange for maintaining competitive prices and steady sales volumes. And while these toxic sweets circulated through neighborhood markets, spreading chemical contamination disguised as childhood pleasure, the condiments that appeared on every dinner table throughout the empire were being systematically tainted with the same types of industrial pigments and manufacturing dyes that were slowly spreading poison through every single bite of what families believed to be properly seasoned food.